Today, we're going to dig into a really pivotal legal opinion from 1975, handed down by the world's highest court. It was a decision that was supposed to clear the air on a super complex colonial situation, but you know what? Its interpretation is still shaping a whole region's destiny. So let's trace the court's incredible journey to its final conclusion.
So, picture this. It's the 1970s. Decolonization is sweeping the globe, and the United Nations is staring down this exact question. In the territory then known as Spanish Sahara, Spain's getting ready to leave, but then its neighbors, Morocco and Mauritania, both step up and say, hey, that land is ours, based on old historical ties. And just like that, you've got a legal puzzle that only the International Court of Justice could even begin to solve.
So here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to follow the court's logic step by step. We'll kick things off with the UN's big dilemma, then break down the two key questions the court had to answer, dive into its incredibly nuanced verdict, and finally, see how it all pointed to one fundamental principle.
Okay, the year is 1974. The decolonization of Spanish Sahara is a hot topic at the UN, but it is anything but simple. Morocco is making its claim, saying it has historic sovereignty. At the same time, Mauritania is making its claim, arguing the territory is part of a bigger cultural group. So with these competing claims flying around, the UN General Assembly basically hit the pause button and said, okay, we need some serious legal clarity before we do anything else.
Now, you gotta understand, this request didn't just come out of nowhere. For years, the UN's whole approach for the territory was self-determination, which usually means, a vote, a referendum for the people living there. But these sudden claims from its neighbors just threw a giant wrench in the works, creating what they called a legal controversy. So this whole court opinion was really about trying to get an active, ongoing decolonization process back on track.
All right, so this brings us to the first big question the court had to tackle, and it's a huge one. It gets right to the heart of how European powers justified colonization in the first place. The UN asked the court to figure out the legal status of the land at the exact moment Spain showed up in 1884.
And to get that, we have to talk about this really important legal idea, terra nullius. Put simply, it was kind of the international law version of finders keepers. If a territory was considered to belong to no one, a country could just claim it by occupying it. It was a really foundational and, let's be honest, deeply problematic reason given for colonial expansion.
So, here it is, the official question for the court. Back in 1884, was Western Sahara a territory belonging to no one? Was it just legally empty and therefore up for grabs?
The court's answer? It was crystal clear, it was unanimous, and it was delivered with absolutely no hesitation. No.
And the court's reasoning was just brilliantly simple. It looked at how countries behaved at the time and found that lands inhabited by people with any kind of social and political organization were not considered terra nullius. And Western Sahara? It was clearly home to nomadic tribes led by their own chiefs. But here's the clincher. Spain itself had signed agreements with these very same chiefs when it set up its protectorate. In other words, Spain's own actions proved they knew they weren't just walking into an empty, ownerless land.
Okay, so with that settled, let's move on to the second question, because this is where things get really complicated. Since the land wasn't empty, the UN needed to know, were there any legal ties between this territory and its neighbors back in 1884? This is where the court had to basically become a team of historians, digging through centuries of evidence.
You had two totally different arguments on the table. Morocco was arguing for a direct line of territorial sovereignty. They claimed the land had been part of their state for ages because the tribes there pledged allegiance to the Sultan. Mauritania, on the other hand, which wasn't even a state in 1884, argued for a different kind of connection, that the territory was part of this bigger cultural and social community, the Bilad Shinguiti. The court had to investigate them both.
Now, you might expect a simple yes or no here, but that's not what the court did at all. The judges had to sift through all this evidence to understand the exact nature of the relationships that existed across this huge nomadic region. This was all about the details.
First up, Morocco's claim of historic sovereignty. Did the evidence really show that the Sultan of Morocco was running the show in Western Sahara back in 1884?
And this is a really crucial distinction the court made. For territorial sovereignty, the court said no. The evidence just didn't show that Morocco was exercising real exclusive state power over the area. But, and this is a big but, they did find a different kind of connection. A legal tie of allegiance between the Sultan and some of the nomadic tribes who moved through that land. It was a personal bond, not a state controlling the land itself. See the difference?
All right, so that's Morocco. Now let's look at Mauritania's claim. Was Western Sahara really part of some cohesive Mauritanian entity way back in the 19th century?
And just like with Morocco, the court drew a really careful distinction here. It said, no, there was no tie of sovereignty or belonging to some distinct legal group. The Balad Shingwiti was a real cultural and social thing, sure, but it didn't have common institutions or a government that would make it a single legal unit. But the court did find that yes, there were other legal ties. These were ties that grew out of the nomadic lifestyle itself, shared rights to things like pastures, wells, and migration paths that crisscrossed what would later become colonial borders.
Okay, so let's recap. The court says the land wasn't empty. And yeah, there were some legal ties to its neighbors. But the million-dollar question is, what does any of that actually mean for the future of the territory? And that leads us to the final, and honestly the most decisive part of the whole opinion.
This right here, this is probably the single most important sentence in the whole opinion. The court is saying that even though it found some historical legal ties, those ties were just not strong enough to get in the way of the most important legal principle for decolonization, self-determination.
So what's the bottom line? The court made it clear that the historical claims from Morocco and Mauritania just didn't add up to actual territorial sovereignty. And those ancient ties, they weren't powerful enough to override the right of the people living there to decide their own future through, as the court said, the free and genuine expression of the will of the peoples of the territory.
And that just leaves us with this one big, lingering question, doesn't it? The court gave everyone legal clarity way back in 1975, and it pointed straight at self-determination. And yet, almost half a century on, the whole situation is still unresolved. This landmark opinion clarified the law of the past, but the challenge of what the free and genuine expression of the will of the people really means for the future of Western Sahara, well, that remains.